Welcome. We wanted to chat to you today a bit about the International Whaling Commission, or the IWC, and really just wanted to know how it works.
So the problem with whaling is that we're trying to use an instrument that was negotiated in the 1940s to regulate behaviour in the 21st century. And the Whaling Convention, which was adopted straight after the Second World War, was a convention for the conservation and regulation of whaling. So it was about the sustainable use of the resource. It was an attempt to put some controls around what was then some very unregulated behaviour and taking of the great whale stocks, and it wasn't very successful. The countries that were engaged in the convention still behaved fairly cavalierly, took whales outside of its terms, and it fell into disrepute. Eventually, people had to stop whaling because the great whale stocks were so heavily decimated, the fin whales and blue whales and of the kind. New Zealand left the convention at the time we stopped whaling ourselves because we didn't see it as relevant to our interests, because we were no longer interested in taking whales. But then in the 1970s, people became much more concerned about whaling, or whales as a kind of iconic conservation outcome, and so a lot of international pressure started to build up on saving the whales. Greenpeace used it as its talismanic sort of signature project, I suppose, and New Zealand, with a bunch of other Western countries mainly, were persuaded to rejoin the Whaling Convention to try and turn what was a convention about the use of whales into a convention for the protection of whales. So the membership of the convention grew quite rapidly in that period, and eventually the conservation numbers outweighed the use numbers. And through the 1980s, we managed to adopt a number of resolutions calling for controls on whaling, and in 1986 actually got an amendment to the schedule to the convention to put in place a moratorium on commercial whaling. So that stopped all commercial whaling for the countries who signed up to the moratorium. Initially, Japan refused, as you're allowed to under the convention. You don't have to sign up to a schedule amendment. Japan objected, so did Norway. Eventually, Japan dropped its objection to the moratorium and became bound by it, whereas Norway has always maintained its objection, which is why Norway continues to take whales on an overtly commercial basis in its waters, but it only fishes in the waters around Norway now. So Japan, having signed up to the moratorium on commercial whaling, expected, I think, that there would be a review of this measure and at some point some lifting of the controls, but there was no political will to do that. So it instead looked to another mechanism in the convention to find a way of taking whales, which is taking whales for scientific purposes. And that's Article 8 of the convention. It has a special regime that allows a country to issue itself permits to take whales for scientific research purposes. And the convention is very permissive. It lets the country set the terms and conditions, and it requires that you use the whales once you've taken them. So that justifies the eating of them afterwards, selling them in the commercial market. And then Japan itself, I suppose, it learnt the lesson of the conservation countries, and it went and started recruiting supporters for its position. So the numbers in the Whaling Convention started to grow again. So when we rejoined it, there were, say, it was about 30 countries, and the numbers went up to 50. Through the 1990s, 2000s, they got to 80. But by the mid-2000s, 2006, the forces were almost equal. And in fact, there was a landmark vote in St Kitts in 2006 in which the Japan side won a resolution by one vote, in which it got its view across that scientific whaling was justified under the convention and permitted. And essentially, it was a moral victory for its perspective.
So you just need a majority to pass a resolution?
To get a resolution passed, you need a 3/4 majority to actually change anything. I should have explained that. So when the moratorium was passed, that was a 3/4 majority, but just simple majorities just are political statements. Okay, but what that showed is that for those of us, it was that this battle had become largely sterile. We were getting absolutely nowhere.
So I understand that New Zealand had an attempt at a compromise position. Can you explain what we were arguing for there?
2007, there was a kind of mutual recognition that this was kind of pointless and we should try and look at something else. And so Japan and the pro-conservation side got together and said, well, maybe there's another way. Maybe we can figure out a way to resolve our problems. And so we entered into what was called a diplomatic process for 2.5 years, in which we tried to negotiate a compromise. Now the problem with that is that neither side was actually willing to change their fundamental positions. So our view, our objective in this was to stop whaling, especially in the Southern Ocean. Japan's objective was to allow it to continue a level of whaling. So if you've got someone wanting to take whales and someone wanting not to take whales, what's the compromise? Probably to allow them to take a few whales. And that was where the direction of the discussions got to. At the end of that process, there was it was an intensive period in which Sir Geoffrey Palmer chaired a meeting of the core countries. New Zealand was very much involved, and at the beginning of 2010, a package was put together that would have allowed it set out a whole bunch of things that would have changed the Whaling Convention to be a more conservation-minded organisation, to get rid of a lot of the sort of silly debates we used to have, and also then it had a schedule to allow a limited level of whaling. Now we couldn't actually agree on the numbers, so the chair of the negotiations, not Sir Geoffrey, the chair of the organisation, was left with the job, not very easy job, of putting the numbers in. And so he put the numbers in, and in the Southern Ocean, what he proposed was 400 whales for the first 5 years, followed by 200 whales for the second 5 years, so an average of 300 whales to be taken, minke whales only, to be taken in the Southern Ocean. Now, from a kind of abstract perspective, that looked quite good. If you think Japan was issuing itself permits to take 850 whales, this would certainly bring the number down. And our not very subtle objective was to get the number so low that Japan would find it commercially uninteresting, and that they would give up whaling. That was our hope, was that this would lead to a withdrawal, complete end of whaling in the Southern Ocean. The problem was that for some countries, any permission of whaling was anathema, and so when we went to the meeting in Morocco in 2010, rather than focusing on getting this package up, there was a kind of push, particularly from this country to South America, but also with Australia, because it had just launched its court case, to basically say we can't have any deal that would allow any level of whaling in the Southern Ocean at all. But Japan said, well, as long as that there are heavy voices against it, we don't believe, because they wanted consensus, no voting, just a consensus outcome. They said no, that's not going to work, so the deal was basically shelved. And a year later we had another meeting, this time in Jersey, in the Channel Islands. That was only a few months ago, and basically it was clear that there was no prospect of reviving any kind of compromise in that way. So let me just explain some of the legal technicalities that apply. People hear that Japan is whaling in a whale sanctuary and that this is something terrible. It's terrible in a symbolic sense, but they're not doing anything illegal, because they use their rights under the Whaling Convention to object to the whaling sanctuary, especially as regards minke whales. So in a technical legal sense, they are within their rights to continue taking whales within the whale sanctuary. Also, because Article 8, the scientific whaling exception, applies regardless of anything else in the convention, so technically you can also go scientific whaling in a whaling sanctuary. So these things might seem nutty in a world political sense, but technically Japan has some legal right on its side as regards that matter.
I hear that Australia is taking Japan to court. How does that work?
We understand Australia's case to be essentially that what Japan is doing in using that scientific whaling exception is in fact commercial whaling in disguise, that it's not a good faith use of the scientific whaling exception. They've got to weigh up the legal issues around the convention with the factual issues. I mean, is what Japan is doing really scientific whaling, or is it commercial whaling in disguise? And that's a very challenging proposition for a court.
So even if the International Court of Justice decides that this is, this really is commercial whaling, what can they really do about it? What sanctions do they have to get Japan to change its ways?
Well, I guess there are a couple of things. I think Japan is a well-respected member of the international community. If the court was to hold that Japan couldn't use the scientific whaling exception, what it was doing, I expect Japan would comply with it, with the decision. The question would be then whether it would want to then withdraw from the Whaling Convention. One of the challenges that we've faced over the last 10 years about this whole exercise is that Japan has been quite open about the fact that if the pro-conservation side so dominate the whaling convention to the point where it's unable to get its voice recognised and its views heard properly, it has said that it would be prepared to consider setting up a rival organisation with its supporters. And we've not wanted that, because obviously if Japan were to do that, it would set up an organisation that would be more directed towards its worldview about taking of natural resources. So the only way we can control Japan's behaviour is through a convention. But you need them to positively be part of that convention for it to work. And that's true of all of these international resource regimes, whether it's fishing or minerals related. You need the parties whose behaviour you're trying to affect to be part of it to have any kind of chance of making things work. I mean, what we've been trying to get Japan to buy into the idea is that the Southern Ocean is something different. We see this as a place where we should try to preserve resources as much as possible. They don't have a need to go whaling. I mean, they don't need whale for their diet. I mean, and not that many people eat it in Japan. That's clear enough from the publicity. It's almost they're insisting on it more for reasons of principle. And we know that part of it, the argument, is that they feel that if they give up on the principle in relation to whales, then the next time that it'll be applied is in relation to fish, and in particular tuna, which is now so much the focus of international attention. And I guess what we're saying to them is you shouldn't see the argument in those terms. I mean, that whales are different, and that there's a perfectly sound case for saying the Southern Ocean whaling is something we should leave alone and let the whales just live. And there's an open question about whether we would also condone whaling in the Northern Hemisphere. Japan also does some whaling up there. But we at least are saying that the Southern Ocean is something special, and let's try to get that protected as the first step.
So what future do you see for the International Whaling Commission?
We don't quite know where the Whaling Commission is going to go from here. I guess our worry is that with this process of compromise coming to an end, we don't quite know where we could revert back to the bad old days of passing resolutions, and they become very acrimonious meetings very quickly. We actually don't think that's a very good outcome. We would prefer to be trying to engage more constructively with Japan, but if there's no hope of getting them to actually contemplate reducing numbers in the Southern Ocean, preferably to zero. In fact, that's our policy. It has to be to zero. Then we can't have a conversation. So we are concerned that the whole whaling convention could become quite destabilised over the next little period because compromise is sort of at an end, and both sides are retreating to their camps, not quite sure where it goes next.
And particularly with the court case coming.
Now, I should say the Japanese, at least ostensibly, say that they're very comfortable with the court case. They think the chances they're losing are not very high. They're confident, I think, well, of course they would be, they'd be confident that the court will say that the convention provides for scientific whaling, and therefore it must be allowed. The question will be to what extent. So from our side, there's some risks in the court case. It could actually end up legitimising what Japan's doing. We don't want that as an outcome.